He walked into my kitchen, picked up the kettle I had used every single morning for 11 years, and said, "We're switching to a coffee maker. This thing takes too long." I was standing right there. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was already opening the cupboard, moving my mugs to the back shelf. I didn't say anything. I turned around and went to sit in the sunroom, the little room off the back of the house where the light comes through in the afternoon, and the old spruce tree taps against the window when the wind picks up. I sat in my chair and looked out at the yard, and I thought about my husband who had planted that spruce tree the year we moved in, who had said it would take 20 years to get tall enough to see from the kitchen window. He had been right. He was usually right about the slow things. Gerald had been gone for 4 years by then, and I had been alone in this house, our house, the one we'd bought in 1989 on a street in Oakville, Ontario, where the lots were wide and the neighbors still waved when you pulled into the driveway. For all 4 of those years, I had shoveled the front walk the first winter myself, badly, but I had done it. I had learned which breaker controlled which room. I had filed my own taxes. I had done all of it, and I had been, if not happy, at least steady. Then my daughter called from Calgary and said her husband had lost his job. She said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing, carefully, with pauses in the right places. She said they needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet. Just for a little while, she said. A few months, maybe. Just until things settled. I said, of course. Because she was my daughter, and because I meant it, and because I did not know then what I know now about what happens when you open a door without agreeing first on when it closes. They arrived in February with 2 cars and a rented trailer. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door like I was a landlord he had never met before. My daughter hugged me for a long time, and I could feel how tense she was, her shoulders up near her ears, and I thought, she is worried about how this will go. I thought she was worried about how this will go. I thought she was worried about me. I understand now she was worried about him. His name doesn't matter. What matters is the shape of the thing. He was a man who had always had an explanation for why things weren't his fault. And when you ran out of explanations, he had a few more. He had been in sales. He was good at the architecture of a sentence, at building something that sounded reasonable right up until you tried to put weight on it. The first month was fine. They kept to themselves mostly. She cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays and left portions in the fridge with little notes on the containers the way she had done when she was a teenager, leaving food for me on late nights. That part felt like her. That part was still my daughter. He was quiet in February, quieter in March. By April, he had started having opinions about the thermostat. 68 degrees, he said, was excessive. I kept the house at 20 degrees Celsius because that is what Gerald and I had always agreed on, and because my knees ache in the cold, and I am 67 years old in my own home. He adjusted it when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I adjusted it back. We did not discuss this directly. It became a kind of silent argument we conducted 3 or 4 times a week. Then came the television. I watched the news every evening at 6, CBC, same as I had done since I was a young woman eating dinner with my parents, in this very region, same as Gerald and I had done together, same as I had done alone in the 4 years since. It was one of the small things that made an evening feel like an evening. He came downstairs one Thursday in April and changed the channel. He didn't ask. He sat down in the armchair, Gerald's chair, the one with the deeper seat cushion, picked up the remote and switched it over to something loud, a game, something with a lot of crowd noise. I looked at him. He looked at the screen. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the carpet for a while. I told myself it was just one evening. I told myself it was a small thing. I told myself what women my age have been telling themselves for decades, that keeping the peace is a kind of generosity, that patience is a virtue, that it's only temporary. That was the first thing I got wrong. By May, he was in the sunroom in the mornings, my sunroom, the room where I had always had my coffee and my book and the particular silence of early morning before the neighborhood woke up. I would come downstairs at 7:30, and he would already be in there with his laptop and his phone calls, talking to people about jobs that never seemed to materialize, and I would pour my coffee and stand at the kitchen counter and drink it because there was nowhere else to go. My daughter saw this. I know she did, but she was the kind of person who could stand in the middle of two things, pulling in opposite directions, and go very still, as though stillness were the same as not choosing. I had raised her to keep peace, I realized that spring. I had raised her too well. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in June. I remember the light because it was the kind of bright June light that makes the kitchen look different, makes the white cupboards almost cream, makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I was sitting in the front room, not my preferred chair, because he was in that, reading a letter from my friend who lives in Fredericton and still writes on paper. There was music coming from upstairs. He had the television on in the basement. He came up from the basement and stopped in the doorway. He said, "Can you do that somewhere else? I need to make some calls and the Wi-Fi's bad in the basement." I looked up from the letter. I said, "I'm reading." He said, "Yeah, I can see that." A pause, the particular pause of a man who is about to say something he has decided he is justified in saying. "Look, I just need the room for an hour. You can read upstairs." I set the letter down on my knee. I have thought many times about what I should have said at that moment. Something quiet and clear. Something that would have made him understand what he had just done, where he was standing, what room this was. But what I actually said was nothing. I looked at him for a long moment, and I felt something shift. And then I folded the letter, and I put it in my cardigan pocket, and I stood up. He was already sitting down before I had reached the hallway. I went to my bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the side of the bed, same as I had done in April, same place, same patch of carpet to stare at. But this time I didn't tell myself it was small, because it wasn't, and I was tired of pretending that it was. I called my friend Loretta that afternoon. Loretta, who had gone through her own version of this with her oldest and his partner, who had told me at the time what I had thought was advice for her, and turned out to be advice she was saving for me. She said, "You waited this long. What are you waiting for?" I said I didn't want to make things hard for my daughter. Loretta said, "Things are already hard for your daughter. You're just the one being polite about it." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. The afternoon light moved across the floor of my bedroom. The old spruce tree was perfectly still outside the window. Gerald had planted that tree the first summer we owned this house. He had been meticulous about the placement, measuring from the fence, from the house, getting the distance right so the roots would have room. He was good at thinking about consequences before they arrived. I had not been good at that this year. I had let things come without being ready for them, and I had hoped that hoping was the same as planning. I called my son the next morning. He's in Winnipeg, works in municipal planning, not given to drama, the kind of man who processes things horizontally rather than vertically, quietly, forward, one step at a time. I told him everything. I told him things I hadn't even let myself think out loud before. About the thermostat, the sunroom, the chair, the 6 months of being moved out of my own rooms like furniture being stored. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, do you want this to change, or do you want to talk about wanting it to change?" He didn't mean it harshly. He is his father's son in that way. He doesn't always soften things, but he doesn't mean them sharp. I said I wanted it to change. He said, then we need to get clear on what the house situation actually is, in writing. I hadn't thought of that. I had never made them sign anything because they were family and it had felt cold, and now I understood that warmth without structure is just a room with no walls. Anything can come in. My son called me back 2 days later with the name of a paralegal in Mississauga who specialized in exactly this situation, a housing and tenancy matter. He said it was more common than I thought. Adult children and their partners moving in, no formal agreement, the parent slowly losing ground. I made the appointment. I want to be honest about this part. I was ashamed, not of the decision, of needing to make it. I had been a mother for 38 years and a wife for 34 years and a homeowner for 35 years, and I needed a professional to help me reclaim my own living room. The text is a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a name. You feel it in the chest, slightly to the left. It feels like the first cold morning of October when you weren't quite ready. The paralegal's name was Sandra, and she was businesslike in the way I needed someone to be businesslike, meaning she did not look at me with pity, she looked at me with information. She explained what the situation was in the eyes of Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act. Even family members who occupy a property can acquire tenancy rights, she said, depending on duration, arrangement, and circumstance. She explained what I needed to do to establish the proper process, to protect myself, and to give them formal notice in a way that was legal and documented and could not be disputed later. I told her they had been there 6 months, that there had been no written agreement, that no rent had been paid or asked for. She said, that actually simplifies things for you. She drafted a notice for me, a formal document. I am an Ontario homeowner. This is my primary residence. There was no tenancy agreement established, and I am requesting the property be vacated within 60 days, which is above the legal minimum, and which I requested because I did not want this to be punitive. I wanted it to be clear. Sandra also helped me draft a letter in plain language, addressed to my daughter and her husband both, explaining the situation and what would happen next and why. She said I did not have to explain myself legally. She said it was my choice whether to do so. I chose to, because one of them was still my daughter. I did not serve the notice myself. My son drove down from Winnipeg for the weekend, and on a Sunday afternoon, when both of them were home, he sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, where I had fed my children cereal and soup and birthday cake for decades, and he laid both documents flat in the center of the table, and he explained what they were. I was in the kitchen. I did not go into the dining room. I stood near the window and looked out at the backyard, and I listened to the sound of the room. My son-in-law's voice went loud immediately. He said things that were not true. He said that I had agreed to longer, that there had been an understanding, that we were family, that this was not the Canadian way of doing things. He said that word, Canadian, as though hospitality and legal rights are the same document. My son did not raise his voice once. My daughter said almost nothing. When I could hear her, she was asking questions I could not make out clearly. Low, careful, the voice she has always used when she is in the middle of something too big for her. I made myself a cup of tea. The new coffee maker was on the counter. I did not use it. I used my kettle. They stayed in the house for 3 more weeks. Not the 60 days, 3 weeks. He moved faster once he understood that the document was real, that my son had sat there without blinking, that there was no version of this conversation where I was going to fold. My son-in-law loaded the rented van with the same energy he had arrived with, efficient and joyless, and pointed away from me. He did not say goodbye. That was fine. Some goodbyes are just doors that needed to close. My daughter came to find me before they left. I was in the sunroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at me, and her face was doing the thing it had done since she was 11 years old, when she had said something she couldn't take back and was deciding whether to try anyway. She said, "I didn't know how to stop it." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have." I said, "Yes." We sat for a while with the truth of it between us, not trying to smooth it over, because some things need to be sat with before they can be moved past. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not done being her mother. I told her she was welcome here, always, but that welcome had a shape now, and that shape had been missing, and we had both paid for it. She cried a little. I held her hand. She left with him because she was still in the part of the story where she believed things would change. I have been in that part myself. I understood it, even if I could not save her from it. There are things you cannot do for your children. One of them is live their lessons for them. The house was quiet that evening in a way it hadn't been in months. Not empty. I have spent enough time with empty to know the difference. This was quiet, the kind that sits still because it belongs to you. I opened the windows in the front room. June air came through, warm and a little green, the way Oakville smells when the trees are full. I moved the armchair, Gerald's chair, back to where it had always been, angled slightly toward the window, the way he used to have it so he could read and watch the street at the same time. I sat down in my own chair, in my own room, in my house, and I turned on the 6 o'clock news, and I watched it at the volume I liked. My son called that evening from Winnipeg. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine and meant it for the first time in a long time. He said he'd come down in the fall, that we could sort out the back garden before the ground froze. I said I'd like that. After I hung up, I sat for a while longer in the quiet. The spruce tree was just visible from where I sat, the top of it catching the last light. Gerald had planted it, knowing he would wait 20 years to see it from the kitchen window. He'd been patient that way with anything worth growing. I had needed this year to learn something he had always known, that love is not the same as surrender, that you can hold the door open with one hand and hold your boundary with the other, and neither one cancels the other out, that a home is not just walls and a mortgage. It is the accumulated weight of a life, and it deserves to be defended with the same quiet care you would give anything you intend to keep. I was 67 years old, and I was still learning. The text I've deciding while I was reparting my party on the back November. I got it rose-sprout before the enough. You are allowed to take your house back. You are allowed to do it without drama, without hatred, and without apology. You are allowed to choose the life that was already yours. I keep thinking about the kettle. It's a small thing to keep coming back to, but he picked it up like it was already his, like the 11 years I had lifted it every morning meant nothing, like habit and history don't leave a mark on objects the way they leave a mark on people. That was the moment, I think, though I didn't know it then. That was when the slow erosion had already begun, and I was still standing there pretending the ground was solid. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it now, is that what happened in my house wasn't just about one difficult man. It was about me, too. About what I allowed to continue because I told myself that tolerance was the same as love. It isn't. I know that now in a way I couldn't have put into words before this year. Love makes room. But love doesn't erase itself to do it. When I stopped asking him to respect my home, I wasn't being generous. I was teaching everyone in that house, including my daughter, that my comfort didn't require protecting. That's the part it cost me the most to sit with. Not his behavior, mine. The something that happens when you spent decades caring for other people, children, a husband, a household, where the habit of putting yourself last starts to feel like virtue. It isn't. It's just a habit. And habits can be changed, even at 67, even after a marriage and a loss and a grief you're still carrying. I changed mine by finally asking the right question. Not, how do I keep the peace, but what do I actually want this house to feel like? The answer came fast. It had always been there. I had just been talking over it. My son driving down from Winnipeg without hesitation, that steadied me. He didn't panic. He didn't lecture. He didn't tell me what I should have done 6 months earlier. He just said, "What do you want to happen?" And then he helped me make it happen. The kind of clear-headedness is its own form of courage, and I don't think I had modeled it well enough for my children when they were young. I modeled endurance. I should have modeled discernment, knowing the difference between what's worth enduring and what simply needs to be addressed. Loretta knew. She had been through her own version, and she said the truest thing anyone said to me that whole year. Things are already hard for your daughter. You're just being polite about it. I had been confusing my silence with kindness for months. She put a name on it in about 10 seconds. What carried me through, what actually got me to Sandra's office, to the document, to the quiet Sunday afternoon when my son laid the papers on my kitchen table, wasn't anger. It was something quieter than anger. It was the decision that I was still a person who deserved to live in her own home in peace, and that deciding that wasn't selfish, it was simply true. I think we do each other a disservice when we tell older women, especially widows, that the gracious thing is always to accommodate. Grace is real. But grace without a spine isn't grace. It's just exhaustion dressed up in better language. The spruce tree is still there. Gerald planted it knowing he wouldn't see it full grown for 20 years. He invested in something he trusted would matter. I'm trying to do the same thing now, just with the years I have left rather than the ones behind me. You can take your life back quietly. You don't need to win an argument to reclaim a room. You just need to be clear about what's yours and willing to stand in that truth long enough for the world to catch up. That, I think, is enough.